Hello there and welcome back. We're going to take our first deep dive into our compositing fundamentals now, and we're going to take a look at tracking. Now, there are three main types of tracking that you can do in compositing, and those are your 2D track, your 2.5D track, and your 3D track. So, what exactly are the differences between these? Let's dive into Nuke and take a look at three examples. So, I've set up a very basic scene here in Nuke with varying camera motions. I've added a little lens distortion so the movement more accurately matches what you would get out of a real camera. And so, right here, what we have is what I would call a 2D trackable shot. What characteristics make up a shot that I would define as 2D trackable? Well, there are two main things I look for in a 2D trackable shot. The first is there any parallax in the area where I'm trying to add my element? Is there any rotation that the object is doing, or is it just standing still? They're typically on a tripod with very little movement, or it could be a handheld shot that isn't wildly swinging around. I think here is a good example. This is a very 2D trackable shot. This wouldn't be difficult to do. And in fact, let's just dive in. I've done a quick point track right here. We'll just look so we see it moving. We've got our point track. All this is doing is moving in X and Y, up and down. In point tracks, you can add multiple trackers to add translation and scale, but again, that's more for zooms. You're not going to get parallax out of a 2D point track. And so I've just quickly applied this motion to some text here. And there we go. It looks like it sticks pretty well. Let's double check that it's sticking well by using a stabilize. There we go. That's pretty sticky. It may drift a little bit in this bottom corner because of lens distortion, but just looking at it in context, you can't tell. Again, your stabilize is going to reveal every possible flaw with your track. The key thing is to look at it in motion and see if it works. And in motion, you can't tell that this is sliding at all. So I think we can get away with it here. The next type of track I want to look at is the 3D track. Let's take a look at what a 3D track would look like in this scene. So you can see we're moving forward. It's like the camera's on a dolly. You can really feel the parallax between objects, but not only their parallax, but their dimensionality. And what do we mean exactly by that? Well, parallax is the relative speeds that two separate objects move based on their distance between the camera, and this creates the feeling of depth. If we look back at our example here, you can see that our cube on the right side is moving much faster and much more quickly than our cylinder behind it, and that is parallax. Parallax can occasionally be handled by a 2D track, but a lot of the times it can't, and that's because of our second factor here, and that is our dimensionality. Dimensionality is kind of like parallax, but for one object. It's the relative speeds that different parts of a single object move based on their distance from the camera. This creates the feeling that an object is more three-dimensional rather than a flat 2D plane. If you look at our sphere on the left here, you'll see that the front of it is moving much faster than the top or the very side that we can see. And between the front and the side, those areas are also moving at different speeds, and this gives us a lot of information about what type of shape this object is in 3 dimensions. Now, 3D tracks are also the slowest track to get, and that's because of a couple reasons. One is that when you're 3D tracking a shot, you're really 3D tracking everything that's in it. You're not tracking one point, you're not just trying to get one area correct like a 2D track. You need everything to stick. You may only need one area to stick really well, but everything else that you're tracking in the scene has to be pretty close. And that's one of the main reasons that it takes so long to do. So the output of a 3D tracker will be a camera. And once you throw your camera over your footage, let's just take a look. All right, we have some text here on our sphere. That's not something we would be able to get with a point tracker, at least not without a lot of struggle. And there are some test cubes scattered throughout this as well to show the many different areas that are sticking in this track. It's not just the sphere that's sticking, it's the overall scene. And again, let's make sure this is actually sticking. Let's look at a stabilize here. I don't want you to get caught up on what these nodes are. By the end of this class, you're going to know everything that's going on here. For right now, we're just focusing on what we're seeing visually. So we've stabilized the center of this sphere, and we can see this is all sticking pretty well. Let's move on to our final category of tracking, which is the 2.5D track. Now, a 2.5D track is a hybrid between the 2D and the 3D track, like it sounds. Now, if you look at this shot, it looks like it should be a 3D track shot. We can see both parallax and dimensionality. You can see very clearly the cube moving in 3 dimensions. But here's the thing. Depending on what element you're adding to the shot, you don't have to go all out and get a 3D track on it. If you have a flat surface, you can fake dimensionality by using a 2.5D track, which is also known as a planar track. So I'm going to play this here and look at our text that's merged over. And there you go. It's a 2.5D track. This is just 4 point tracks combined, and it's adding some dimensionality to our track. 2.5D tracks are perfect for things like monitor burn-ins, people who are holding phones in their hands and wildly waving them around, adding a mural to a wall. Any surface that is flat, even if there's a 3D move in the camera, you can generally get away with doing a 2.5D track. We wouldn't be able to pull off a planar track on this sphere over here. It wouldn't end up sticking because really we can only make it stick to 4 points. The cylinder, I think we would also have a hard time getting a 2.5D track to stick due to how round it is. But the floor here, for instance, it's a flat surface. So if we wanted to add something to the floor, we don't need to do a full 3D track on this. We can just do a 2.5D corner pin. And so again, let's make sure this is sticking correctly by using our stabilize. You can see our perspective changing as the camera tilts down, but our text is sticking pretty well. So these are the main 3 types of tracks you'll see. To briefly summarize, your 2D track is just for X and Y motion and occasionally zooms. It's the most straightforward track and the fastest. Your 2.5D track is when you're trying to track planar surfaces, anything that could be put on a flat grid. It's not the fastest technique, but it's also not the slowest. And your 3D track is when your shot introduces a lot of parallax and dimensionality that needs to be reflected in the element you're adding. When you're looking at a shot, typically you'll be able to hone in on what type of track it will be without doing any work. Sometimes you might be like, that might be a 2D track, but it also might be a 2.5D, but you can certainly hone in on 1 or 2 types that track can be. And when that happens, I recommend starting with the fastest option, and you'll know pretty quickly if that's going to work or not, and if you need to escalate it to the next type of track. So let's practice this now and look at a few examples and determine what type of track we would need to use. All right, so we have our first shot here. Let's take a look. It looks like we have a handheld shot standing behind our actor. In this example, we're going to say we're going to replace the rock on the far right side with, say, a CG statue. Now, analyzing this, I see a lot of 2D motion. The camera's not moving forward or backwards. Really, it's staying in relatively the same spot. I'm not seeing much parallax, and I'm not seeing any dimensionality. So with those in mind, I'm very comfortable saying we can definitely use a 2D track to get our element to stick for this shot. Moving on to the next shot. All right, it looks like we're on a tripod here. This is much smoother. We are tilting up and panning to the left. And let's add some graffiti to those 2 rocks to the upper right side of frame. So let's see, is there any parallax in the shot? Not really, I'm not seeing a ton. Is there any dimensionality in the shot? Well, there could be. I have a feeling, even though it's subtle, and this is just through experience, that in those top 2 rocks up there, we're seeing a little shift in their plane, but I don't think it's enough to warrant a full 3D track. So I think we can call that one a 2.5D track, and we'll be able to get our graffiti to stick. All right, looks like we have a drone shot here. You can immediately see a ton of parallax and a lot of dimensionality in these foreground rocks here. And so that immediately screams out 3D track. But let's hold on for a second. It depends what we want to do to this shot. If we just wanted to replace the sky, there's really not any dimensionality to it. It's all so far away. There's probably a little scaling up that would happen. So if we were replacing the sky, this could be a 2D or a 2.5D track. You can do slight zooms with 2D point tracks. But if we were adding something in this foreground here, it would definitely need to be 3D tracked, unless we were just adding a very small patch, in which then I would say we could do a 2.5D track. All right, let's go through our checklist here. It looks like Our camera's not on a tripod, it's handheld, and it's slightly moving forward. And I think that slight move forward is going to give us a lot more trouble than we would think. Because you might look at these monitors that we're going to be replacing and say, we could probably just do a point track on that. But I think the way that they're angled towards camera is introducing a little bit of subtle dimensionality. So I would say for this, we would definitely want to do a 2.5D track. It looks like in this shot, our camera is on a steady cam and we are tracking to the right. There's a little bit of rotation we can see there. In this shot, let's say we're adding leaves falling from all of these trees. There's a lot of parallax in this shot, so we would definitely want to grab a 3D track for that. If the task was to say add framed pictures to each one of these trees, you could potentially do that as a 2.5D track, but you would have to do that for each individual tree. So a 3D track really makes the most sense here. All right, for our final shot, we have a slight tilt up. Not really seeing any dimensionality in here. It is kind of hard because there are no objects in the top half of the screen. So there might be some slight dimensionality, but you can't really tell. So we'll have to keep that in mind. In this shot, let's say we're adding a giant statue in the midground there. So I would think this would either need to be a 2D point track or a 3D track. Why not a 2.5D track? Well, there's no object that's on the same plane where we want to add our statue. And so there's nothing that we can really track. So I would try a 2D track first, and if that doesn't stick, we're going to have to 3D track this to get the dimensionality, because a 2.5D track only works if you can track the actual plane that you're adding your element to. All right, and that's the end of our examples. That sums up our compositing fundamental of tracking. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.